I recently had to say goodbye to my favorite pair of shoes. Um, they were worn down, full of holes, but they'd been with me through so much, it felt like saying goodbye to a part of myself. Got me thinking about how we cling to things, both physical and emotional, even when they're no longer serving us. And that's actually what today's Deep Dive is all about. We're exploring the Buddhist concept of the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness, and how understanding them can be the key to understanding our own suffering.
It's fascinating how these sources use the simple act of eating as an analogy to illuminate these complex ideas.
Right. And what's so relatable is that it's not just about physical hunger. Even the thought of food, the mental image, triggers these aggregates.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that form isn't limited to our physical bodies. It includes anything we can perceive, like that delicious slice of cake we might be craving.
And then there's feeling, the pleasure of taste, the satisfaction of a full stomach, maybe even the guilt afterward.
But it's not just about those immediate sensations. It's also about the deeper emotions we associate with food. Comfort, nostalgia, maybe even anxiety around certain foods.
It's like our whole relationship with food is a microcosm of the five aggregates.
The sources also point to perception, how we identify hunger, recognize what's edible, what's delicious, what's forbidden, all those labels we attach to food.
And this leads us to fabrication. It's all the mental activity around getting that food, planning the meal, following the recipe, even driving to the grocery store.
And underlying all of this is consciousness, that awareness of each sensation, thought, and action. The sources are clear. These five aggregates are constantly shaping our experience, and they form the foundation of our sense of self.
But here's the thing, and this is where the analogy gets really insightful. The sources argue that our clinging to these aggregates, our identification with them, is the root of our suffering.
The way we grasp onto pleasant feelings, resist unpleasant ones, and constantly strive for satisfaction through these aggregates. It creates a cycle of craving and aversion that keeps us bound to suffering.
And they suggest that the practice of concentration, specifically focusing on the breath, can offer a way out.
It's like a laboratory for observing these aggregates in action. The breath becomes the object of form. The sensations we experience during meditation become feeling. The labeling of the breath as in or out becomes perception, and so on.
So it's not just about achieving a blissful state of concentration. It's about using this focused awareness to see how these aggregates are constantly arising and passing away.
It's about recognizing their impermanent nature and understanding how our clinging to them creates suffering. The sources actually point to a specific type of concentration called jhana as a powerful tool for cultivating this insight.
Okay, let's dive a little deeper into jhana. What exactly is it, and how does it help us see through these aggregates?
Jhana is a state of profound absorption and stillness achieved through focused attention. The sources describe it as a series of progressively deeper stages of concentration, each characterized by specific qualities of mind.
So how does it relate to this idea of disenchantment, of seeing the aggregates for what they are?
As we move through the stages of jhana, the sources explain, our awareness becomes increasingly refined. We start to see the subtle ways in which these aggregates arise and pass away. The pleasure we experience in jhana, for example, is still a form of feeling, but it's a much more refined and subtle form compared to the fleeting pleasures we chase in everyday life.
So by experiencing these deeper levels of concentration, we start to see that even the most pleasurable states are still impermanent.
Exactly. And as we develop this insight, our clinging to these aggregates naturally begins to weaken. We see that they're not a reliable source of lasting happiness.
It's like we're shifting our perspective from, I need this to be happy, to, this is simply a fleeting experience, and clinging to it only creates suffering.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective, the sources argue, is the key to unlocking a state of true liberation.
So we're starting to see how clinging to those aggregates keeps us stuck in that cycle of suffering. But how do we actually break free? How do we reach that state of liberation the sources call release?
It begins, as the sources explain, with a fundamental shift in perception.
From clinging to letting go. Right. But that sounds so much easier said than done.
The sources suggest focusing on the aggregate of perception as a starting point. It's the lens through which we interpret our experience.
So instead of trying to change our feelings or force ourselves to let go of things, we start by changing how we perceive them.
Yes, the sources highlight that perception plays a crucial role, especially in practices like jhana, where focus is key. By observing how we label experiences as good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, we can begin to disentangle ourselves from those labels.
Can you give an example of how this might play out in real life?
Absolutely. Let's say you're someone who's deeply attached to their physical appearance. That's clinging to the aggregate of form. You might spend hours at the gym, obsess over every wrinkle, constantly compare yourself to others, but through the practice of observing your perception, you might start to see that this pursuit of a perfect body is fueled by insecurity, fear of aging, a desire for external validation.
So you're not denying the feelings of insecurity, but you're seeing them as impermanent, as arising and passing away like any other sensation.
Exactly. And as you continue to observe, you might start to question the very notion of a perfect body. You might start to appreciate the beauty of aging, the uniqueness of your own features. This shift in perception, this disenchantment with the aggregate of form, can then ripple out to other areas of your life.
It's like a domino effect. So for example, if you let go of clinging to a particular body image, that might free you from clinging to the need for validation from others, which is a form of clinging to the aggregate of feeling, right?
Precisely. The sources emphasize that the aggregates are interconnected. Disenchantment with one can lead to disenchantment with all of them.
And this is what ultimately leads to the experience of release.
Yes, as the sources describe it, release is a state of profound peace and freedom, a liberation from the suffering caused by clinging to those aggregates.
But isn't that a bit of a paradox? We're using concentration, a form of clinging to the breath, to achieve a state of non-clinging.
It's a brilliant point, and the sources address this directly. They explain that the focus on the breath is simply a skillful means, a tool for training the mind. It's like using a raft to cross a river. Once you reach the other shore, you no longer need the raft.
So concentration helps us cultivate the awareness and insight we need to let go of clinging altogether.
Precisely. And this release isn't just a fleeting experience, a temporary high. The sources describe it as a transformative shift in consciousness that brings about profound insights.
What kind of insights are we talking about? What changes when you experience this release?
Well, one of the most significant insights is a deeper understanding of the relationship between our actions and our experience of reality. The sources describe it as a realization that our experience of space and time is deeply intertwined with the aggregate of fabrication, all those mental actions we engage in.
So it's not just about observing the aggregates, but also understanding how our thoughts, intentions, and actions shape our reality.
Exactly. And with that understanding comes a heightened sense of responsibility. The sources emphasize the importance of skillful actions, particularly actions rooted in non-harming, as a crucial element of the path to complete liberation.
It's like we're realizing that we're not just passive observers, but active participants in creating our experience.
That's a powerful way to put it. And another profound insight that comes with release is the realization that our identification with those aggregates is ultimately a limiting choice. It's not who we truly are.
That must be a pretty humbling realization, especially coming from a place of having experienced the deathless, as the sources describe it.
Humility is definitely a key theme here. The sources emphasize that this state of liberation, this deathlessness, was always accessible, but our clinging to those aggregates clouded our vision.
Wow, that's a powerful image, that this state of freedom is always within reach, but our own attachments keep us from experiencing it.
And with that realization often comes a renewed sense of motivation to pursue complete liberation, fueled by the understanding that engaging with those 5 aggregates, even in seemingly positive ways, ultimately leads to suffering.
So it's not about rejecting those aggregates entirely, but rather shifting our relationship to them.
Yes, it's about recognizing their impermanent nature and not falling into the trap of clinging to them as sources of lasting happiness. The sources actually offer some really interesting touchstones to help distinguish genuine release from those fleeting moments of insight or bliss we might experience along the way.
That's really helpful, because this release sounds so profound. How can we be sure we're not just fooling ourselves, mistaking a temporary high for the real deal? What are those touchstones? Okay, tell me about these touchstones. What should we be looking for to know if we're on the right track?
The sources highlight 2 key indicators. The first is what they call grounding. True release should feel secure and safe, not disorienting or unsettling. Think of it like finding solid ground after being tossed around in a storm.
So if it feels like you're floating away or losing touch with reality, that's probably not the genuine article.
Right. It's more about finding a deeper sense of stability and peace within yourself.
It's about finding that inner peace.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that genuine release isn't about escaping reality, but rather seeing it more clearly without the distortion of clinging. And the second touchstone they offer is understanding. There should be a clear comprehension of the process that led to this release, a recognition of the role your own mental actions played in shaping your experience.
So it's not just about having a blissful experience, but also understanding the how and the why behind it. It's about gaining true insight, not just chasing a fleeting feeling. I'm curious, though, what happens after you've experienced this release? Do you just stay in that blissful state forever?
That's a great question, and it's something the sources actually address. They caution that even those who've experienced genuine release can become complacent or heedless, allowing their practice to slacken.
Because they think they've reached the finish line, like they've graduated from the school of non-clinging.
In a way, yes. But the sources emphasize that the journey toward complete liberation is an ongoing process, a constant refinement of our understanding and our actions.
So the key takeaway here is don't get cocky. Even amidst profound experiences, there's always more work to be done. It's about integrating these insights into our daily lives and continuing to cultivate that awareness of the five aggregates.
Absolutely. This journey isn't about achieving a static state of perfection, but rather about engaging in a dynamic process of self-discovery and transformation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it back to our listener. What does all of this mean for you? How can you apply these insights to your own life?
It starts with paying attention. The next time you're feeling stressed, anxious, or dissatisfied, take a moment to observe how those five aggregates are operating.
Think back to the eating analogy. When you reach for that bag of chips, are you truly hungry? Or is it boredom, stress, a habit you're clinging to? What thoughts and feelings arise as you eat?
By becoming more aware of those aggregates, we can start to loosen their grip on our sense of self.
In that disentanglement, that gradual letting go, is what ultimately leads to liberation, to that state of release. The sources offer a truly radical perspective on who we are.
If our sense of self is constructed from those impermanent, ever-changing aggregates, then what does that say about our true nature? What lies beyond those limitations?
That's the question I'll leave you with today. A question to contemplate, to explore within your own experience. And as always, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep.